hear us talking. So I'm going to just screen share with you, and I'll get that sort of set up now. Okay. So, as Joe mentioned, this is an introductory talk, and it's going to cover a lot of subjects in a very broad way. And we're going to look at the sort of drivers historically for climate change, and also some of the ideologies behind that, and how they still influence things to this day. So as part of this, you're going to be given information related to colonialism, racism, capitalism, neo-colonialism, and you might be familiar with some of those terms, you might not, and hopefully you'll get a little introduction to them, and actually how they're related to the current climate emergency. So later in the talk, we're also going to explore some solutions to combating some of these seemingly insurmountable obstacles. So, as I said, some of the information might be new, and if it is, we're also happy to provide you with a list of resources after the talk so you can get a better understanding for yourself. Okay, so by the end of the talk, we hope you're going to have a basic understanding of who the climate breakdown currently impacts most upon, and that is the global south. We hope to give you a bit of a history of why this has happened, and also who is responsible mainly for climate breakdown at this time. We'll look at the forces and structures and thinking that sort of uphold and maintain what we call the global north's position. And then we'll move on to how change needs to happen on many different fronts and how we rebuild and rethink. So, climate breakdown is not just an ecological crisis, important though that is, it's also an economic and social crisis, which makes worse so much of the inequality and injustice of our economic system that it's all rooted in. And capitalism has caused this crisis, but what we're also going to see how it's inextricably linked to past colonialism and its present day descendant neo-colonialism. So, the global north has been responsible for this current climate catastrophe, and it is mainly the global south and people in poverty everywhere that are feeling the effects and live with the consequences of climate change and all of the social and economic injustices of capitalism. We hope to show you through this talk that climate change cannot be reversed without making big changes to our economic system, and that climate justice, that fighting to rebalance the social, economic and ecological inequalities affecting people mainly in the global south, but also poor people across the world, is an integral part of stopping climate change. So, first bit, business as usual is wrecking the planet. Now, this slide is, well, I think it is quite amazing. It shows golfers playing at a golf course in Washington in September of 2017. And behind them, what you see is the Eagle Creek wildfire. And that's only a mile away on the other side of the Columbia River in Oregon. I think it's such an apt image of what we in the global north are doing constantly, and particularly our governments, pretending that this climate catastrophe of a monster is not behind us. And you know, we've got here a golf course, a biodiversity desert essentially, consuming scarce and natural resources like water for the benefit of elite small minorities. You know, so we have a privileged elite exploiting valuable land and resources for their own benefit, completely unconcerned for those being consumed in the raging fire of the climate emergency. In the next section on the effects of climate change, we'll be looking at some recent examples of who has been affected and how.
So people in the global south have already been seriously affected by climate change. Between March and May in 2018, long rains were 150 to 200% above the normal in some East Africa locations. This obviously brought some relief to herders as livestock benefited from renewed grasslands. However, as you can see in this slide, in many places, flash floods and overflowing rivers wiped out crops, roads, bridges, as here, thwarting both cultivation and relief activities. The sixth poorest country in the world is Mozambique. The average citizen in the US is responsible for 55 times the carbon emissions of the average citizen in Mozambique. On the 14th of March in 2019, Cyclone Idai made landfall near Beira City in Mozambique, and it was a Category 2 storm. It's brought heavy rains and strong winds, which led to flash flooding, hundreds of deaths, and massive destruction of both property and crops. To make matters worse for the country, less than 6 weeks later, on the 25th of April, Cyclone Kenneth dealt a hard blow to northern Mozambique, about 600 miles north of Idai's impact zone. Cyclones Idai and Kenneth were two of the top five worst storms ever to have hit Mozambique. It caused catastrophic flooding, which affected close to 2.2 million people there and also in Zimbabwe and Malawi. And it caused an unprecedented amount of damage, as you can imagine. In May 2020, villages were devastated in Bangladesh's most intense cyclone in 2 decades, Cyclone Amphan. It destroyed the homes of 500,000 people. By July, 1/3 of the country was underwater after flooding caused by the heaviest rains in 10 years, and this affected 1.5 million people. Rising ocean temperatures and sea levels are another devastating effect of climate change. Coral reefs are threatened by rising ocean temperatures, and the Maldives also faces the threat from rising sea levels. Their highest point is only 6 feet above sea level. So it won't take much to cause chaos. Low-lying atoll nations such as the Maldives are on the climate front lines. Coral nations will be hit first by climate change and hit hardest, as Mohamed Nasheed said. He's the president of the Maldives, as you see here. The Pacific Island archipelago of Tokelau is threatened by rising sea levels as well. And Michele Maivava wrote an open letter. We know that the longer the fossil fuel industry gets its way, the worse climate change will be, and the more sea level rise will threaten our islands. But giving up on our home is not an option. We are not drowning, we are fighting. Those were his words. As we know, climate change doesn't just cause flooding. A fatal heat wave swept across India and Pakistan from May to June in 2019, with temperatures rising to 50.8 degrees centigrade. And this, combined with a delayed monsoon, caused a serious drought, with many deaths again, loss of crops and water shortages. Cities like Chennai struggled to meet the demand for water. Vulnerable communities and women and children were hardest hit as they were forced to wait hours in the heat, waiting to fill their water pots. Water scarcity is a fate facing many communities across the Indian subcontinent. transforming once lush paddy fields into abandoned farmland, scarred by dried riverbeds. Yet these are just a handful of the most recent examples. There are thousands of heartrending stories from around the world, and there will be thousands more as climate crisis deepens. The question really is, when will we start listening? These countries are examples of those who were impoverished first by colonialism, then by decades of having the global economy rigged against them. Their natural assets, such as oil, were plundered by companies mainly from the global north. And they're now much more vulnerable to climate breakdown because of their economic situation, which we're going to explore in the next section.
We're now going to think about the displacement of people and communities being caused by climate change in the global south. Flooding, drought, and rising sea levels are forcing many people to leave their homes. The UN recognizes that climate change is making life for people in certain parts of the world unsustainable and forcing them to leave their homes. In the words of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, climate change is now found to be the key factor accelerating all other drivers of forced displacement. These persons are not truly migrants in the sense that they did not move voluntarily. As forcibly displaced, but not covered by the refugee protection regime, they find themselves in a legal void. As we heard earlier, Bangladesh is one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. River erosion, flooding, and cyclones are forcing people to leave their homes. Most are displaced within the country. There has been a dramatic increase in rural to urban migration, resulting in people living in slums on the edge of the capital city, where there is huge pressure on basic urban infrastructure such as fresh water supply. The Sahel belt in sub-Saharan Africa is another part of the world badly affected by climate change. The United Nations estimates that 80% of the farmland is degraded, and in 2020, it identified 3 million people as being displaced. Climate change cannot be separated from other factors which result in people being forced to leave their homes. In the Sahel belt, climate change has aggravated intercommunal violence, which in turn is increasing environmental degradation. The majority are displaced internally or to adjacent countries, where people live in makeshift refugee camps. The living conditions and the lack of opportunities for improving the quality of their lives in these camps means that some people take the perilous route through Libya and then across the Mediterranean, hoping to reach Europe. Kiribati is a group of low-lying islands in the Pacific threatened with being submerged. Decreasing land area and storm damage are making life increasingly difficult and displacing its people. One of its citizens left to make a new life in New Zealand and has been threatened with deportation. He claimed refugee status, but the court denied him asylum as the islands are not yet totally uninhabitable, so his right to life was not immediately threatened. The Environmental Justice Foundation estimated that weather-related extremes displaced 21.5 million people from their homes between 2008 and 2016. It's really hard to grasp what these big numbers mean, but that's the equivalent of 41 people every minute. Continuing carbon emissions will result in more extreme weather and are likely to result in exponential increase in the numbers of the people displaced. Despite the magnitude of this issue, environmentally induced displacement is not covered by the 1951 Refugee Convention on the grounds that climate refugees are not fleeing persecution, which is a requirement needed to fulfill the traditional refugee model when applying for resettlement in another country.
There is a strong link between colonialism, neo-colonialism, racism, and the climate crisis. Alexandra Wanjihu-Kelbert of Black Lives Matter UK has said, We're not saying that climate change affects only Black people. However, it is communities in the global South that bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change, whether physical, floods, desertification, increased water scarcity and tornadoes, or political, conflict and racist borders. And these are the words of Nimo Bassi, Nigerian environmental activist, author and poet. We in the global South are feeling the impacts of the climate crisis already, while the elite in the global North are often able to lift themselves free from the most severe aspects of the crisis. They forget that the climate crisis will eventually spare no one if real actions are not taken today. Colonialism, this picture really shows it graphically, doesn't it? Colonialism violently decimated economies in the global South, channeling wealth and resources back to colonial countries like the UK. 80% of the African continent was colonized by European powers by 1900. Neo-colonial extractivism is fundamental to London's stock exchange, especially minerals and metals. Are you, by any chance, a shareholder, directly or indirectly? If so, then track back your investments. Or does your bank lend to multinationals extracting copper, bauxite, diamonds, lithium, etc. from the global South? If so, divest and switch. Fossil fuels are only part of the picture.
So this extractivism, aka resource theft, also involved converting the bodies of indigenous men and women into commodities to be ruthlessly exploited. The church and scientific establishment in Europe colluded in deciding that Black people were not actually human, creating a racist philosophy to justify this exploitation. Slavery was fundamental to the industrial development in Europe, which caused and continues to cause catastrophic climate change. These colonial and racist relationships remain at the heart of the global economy. So the poorest communities across the world continue to be pushed from their lands and robbed of their resources, while indigenous land defenders who dare to oppose this are targeted and killed in order to keep the fossil fuel economy in motion and to provide grazing to feed the Western meat-hungry diet. Now, a big driver of rainforest destruction is to create grazing land for meat herds and to grow the feed needed to feed animals reared for meat, to satisfy the huge demand for meat from the global North, which is why many people are now seeing the link between moving to a more plant-based diet and slowing ecological degradation and climate change.
So what is the legacy of these extractive ideologies and practices? Yes, carbon emissions. Let's look at who has historically produced the most and the least. This map is taken from a site created by Duncan Clark and Robin Houston, aka Kiln. It's a website that uses an animated interactive map to help convey how different countries fit into the climate change picture, both the causes and the risks. And what we see here is a world map reflecting pictorially the historical CO2 emissions of various countries between 1850 and 2011. Those that have emitted the most CO2, are shown enlarged. A clear picture of who has contributed most to climate change. Note the sizes of the UK, USA, and Europe. This great martini glass image was produced by Oxfam in their 2015 report, Extreme Carbon Inequality. And it shows clearly that the wealthiest 10% of people are responsible for 49% of total lifestyle consumption emissions.
This image breaks down the figures to parts of the world, and what we see clearly are the countries who were subjugated under colonialism almost exclusively in what is now referred to as the Global South, are also those who produce and have historically produced the least emissions. These are the countries that are coloured in yellow and green on this map. However, as we've seen earlier, these people are subject to catastrophic climate-related emergencies at a scale unknown as yet in the global north. Okay, Australia and USA have had devastating wildfires, but their economic situations mean that they are in a far better position to deal with these climate emergencies. So the legacy, and what about China? China is often blamed because it currently produces the most CO2 emissions. And as activists on the street, we often get asked, well, or told, why should we change our behaviour? China should change first. Well, firstly, China has 20% of the world's population. And secondly, a lot of those emissions are caused in producing goods that we import and consume.
In 2019, Britain imported £46.2 billion worth of goods from China, and China imported £23.4 billion worth of goods from Britain. This imbalance is repeated across countries in the global north. So who should take responsibility when accounting for emissions in producing these goods? The producer? The consumer? It has been suggested that accountability should be shared between the producer and the consumer. China's domestic consumption is also rising, but each Chinese citizen's consumption emits much less CO2 than their counterparts in the more developed world. We've just seen how the colonizing empires of an old world left an invisible legacy for future generations to deal with now.
Well, corporate power drives climate breakdown, the new colonizers. We will now talk about how corporate power drives climate breakdown and acts as a new form of colonialism. 70% of the world's carbon emissions, 70% are caused by just 100 multinational companies. However, our current idea of the so-called free market means that these companies use their lobbying power to stop governments taking effective climate action. Neoliberalism is the economic model followed by most governments of the global north. It involves market-orientated policies which encourage unfettered growth regardless of the consequences to people and planet. It results in privatization of resources, huge increases in inequality, and huge increases in the rich and poor divide, and governments unwilling or unable to curb big business. This is true from big pharmaceutical and agribusinesses like Monsanto to oil giants and mining and fracking concerns like Shell, who are operating in the Congo and the Niger Delta, where it is known that they employ mercenaries to protect their interests and displace the local people from their land. Neoliberalism is just another guise of colonialism. Extraction of resources by force and exploitation of indigenous people, including child labour. In this photo taken in the Democratic Republic of Congo, extraction of cobalt for mobile phones and electric vehicle batteries has been linked to human rights abuses, child labour, corruption, environmental destruction, and land grabbing. We need robust legislation for our governments to stop the assault on our world from big business. Over to Guy.
Guy, are you there? I'm not sure whether Guy's on mute or...
I'm unmuted.
Are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Okay, sorry.
We're at slide 50.
So, modern trade deals lock corporate demands into international law. They prevent governments returning privatized services into public hands, stop governments banning the dirtiest fossil fuels, and create ever longer climate impacting supply chains. Environmental regulations are watered down, and corporate courts allow investors to sue governments in secret, outside of the national legal system. The Energy Charter has been invoked against governments trying to reduce carbon emissions. A few examples. RWE, a German energy company, is suing the Netherlands over the phase-out of coal-fired power stations, while another energy company, Uniper, is threatening to do the same. Ascent Resources, and that's here in the UK, a UK fossil fuel company, is about to sue Slovenia for requiring an environmental impact assessment on fracking plans. And another UK fossil fuel company, Rockhopper, is suing Italy over a ban on offshore oil drilling close to the coast. Such trade deals massively threaten campaigns for climate justice.
So moving towards a just transition, as we've heard, climate breakdown will hit the least well-off hardest, while the benefits of economic growth are enjoyed by most of the world's rich. So climate justice demands that wealthy countries in the global north take responsibility for effective climate action, and also that the wealthy 1% need to bear the cost of the transition. In doing this, we need to learn from our past and listen to those most affected. The Green New Deal is a proposal in both the UK and elsewhere for massive state investment from governments in the global north to replace carbon-intensive jobs with good quality green jobs, totally decarbonise the economy, not just through renewable energy and energy efficiency, but through a transformation of our farming, transport and more. This global change needs to be planned and implemented in collaboration with communities in the global south. A just transition would rebalance economies affected by deindustrialisation and break the dominance of big finance, including cancelling debt, even from private finance. Big banks and speculators like BlackRock and HSBC are making up to 250% profit on their loans to global south governments and are currently owed enough by African governments to vaccinate the entire continent against COVID-19 3 times over. Without including these private creditors in debt cancellation and using legislation to force them to comply, many countries will continue to fork out more to these banks than they spend on healthcare in an entire year. A just transition would unite workers and affected communities in the south with workers in the global north. Transfers of climate technology and funding to the global south are also vital, along with a commitment to welcome climate refugees. The global north is responsible for initiating the fossil fuel era and has a responsibility to work with the global south to find solutions. Here's a quick recap of what a just transition could look like. Some people claim that a model called green capitalism can offer a solution to climate change, but we suggest it will never address the deep-seated inequalities necessary for capitalism to function. So next, we'll look at what changes in our system might be needed.
So our economic system needs a big overhaul. To truly deal with the climate crisis, we need to move away from a system based on growth and corporate profit making. All areas of our lives are affected by this economic system which holds profit and growth at its core, and the long history of colonialism coupled with the climate emergency means that those in the global south are disproportionately affected. Democratizing the economy can allow us to take decisions in the interests of the climate and social justice. If we look at energy, some of the countries which have the highest energy resources are also those where the least number of people have access to electricity. This has been seen in Indonesia, Nigeria, and Sumatra, where the business interests of the global north are apparent. A combination of public and cooperative ownership of our energy system, for instance, can lead the way towards affordable and clean energy for all, and a system that puts people before profit. Examples of this kind of energy democracy can already be seen around the world. So in Spain, Som Energia, We Are Energy in Catalan, is a cooperative set up in 2011 at a time when the two largest energy companies controlled 80% of the energy market. It now has 71,000 members and is focused on solar, wind and biogas energy. Anyone who shares their values can join for €100, and their aim is to achieve a 100% renewable model. In Costa Rica, 99.7% of the energy mix is renewable, thanks to a state-owned energy provider, which together with 4 rural energy cooperatives is also responsible for ensuring over 99% access to electricity. This is an unusually high level for the global south. And at the centre of the climate crisis is the problem of profit maximising endless growth. To deal with it, we need to redistribute wealth and power away from corporations and towards collective and common ownership. New economic models do exist that can deliver this, such as donut economics. This is a model already being used in the city of Amsterdam. Big business has designed the consumer economy to maximise individual consumption and to minimise sharing and collaboration, accountability and transparency. A move away from individual consumption and towards sharing and collaboration is urgently needed, and most obviously in the global north. This can extend to all aspects of life. A focus on developing a collective well-being not only means that we would be working to address some of the disparities in life experience and opportunities across the world, but we could also reduce material consumption and bring more attention to the things that people need and value: healthcare, education, housing, and social care, plus of course food production and distribution, not to forget cultural needs as well. So I'll pass over to Dinah now.
So we wonder, is another world possible? Well, yes, another world is possible. To do that, we have to respond to climate breakdown, and we have to learn from international struggles. Forging solidarity across movements and borders, it means nothing other than building our collective power to challenge global elites and remake our world. To do that, we need to focus not just on carbon emissions, but also on systemic questions of racism, colonialism, exploitation, and corporate power. Those who most benefit from the system remaining as it is will never voluntarily take the steps we need to stop the climate crisis. But together, we can force governments to act. For example, we can press our governments nationally and internationally to make ecocide an international crime recognized as such by the International Criminal Court. Ecocide is mass damage and destruction to ecosystems, harm to nature which is widespread, severe, or systematic. This will mean that those individuals within corporations or governments who are responsible for funding, permitting, or causing severe environmental harm will be liable to criminal prosecution. As the reality of the climate crisis hits home, more and more people are refusing to see their future destroyed by the greed of the few. Taking a lead from those communities at the forefront of climate breakdown, we can build a movement to win climate justice.
So we're going to think about anti-racism now. And some people may ask, well, why do we have to get involved with anti-racism as part of our climate activism? Well, we think this is essential if we wish to work as a truly inclusive movement, not just offering tokenism and lip service, but to be real and effective allies to oppressed Black and ethnic minority groups, both in the global South and here. So, as we've seen, racism was invented to justify slavery and colonial exploitation. As Rennie Edo-Lodge explains here, we tell ourselves that racism is about moral values, when instead it is about the survival strategy of systemic power. So racism still fuels neocolonialism. This philosophy suggests that some people are more deserving of human rights than others. And now, speaking for a moment to the white people here, and speaking as a white person, we might be trying very hard not to be racist because we have an idea that being racist is morally wrong. But maybe we need to accept that if we've grown up in a systemically racist society, we must have internalized some unconscious racist colonial attitudes. And we also need to accept that we have white privilege, where white people do not suffer from racism and can choose not to think about it, where Black people or people of colour do not have that choice because it is part of their lives, as we have seen in the presentation so far. And in terms of climate breakdown, some of us in the climate justice group in Exile Lewis have realised that along with reversing the effects of colonialism in the world, white people need to take responsibility for reversing the effects of colonialism on our minds.
And for Black people and people of colour here today, we appreciate your patience while we talk about this issue, which is white people's problem, though of course it affects you mainly. And of course it's maybe worth stressing that it's up to white people to educate ourselves about our racism and not to rely on individual people of colour to explain it all to us, while also they're making sure that we don't get too upset by the conversation.
So maybe like you, I felt I had seen the importance of educating myself about racism, what it is, the history of racism, and of the fight against racism. But the Black Lives Matter movement has propelled me to approach this again. And I have been pretty shocked at how naive I've been at acknowledging the continuing existence of systemic racism in the UK. And I also felt very uncomfortable at first thinking about my white privilege.
Black British writers and British writers of colour, such as Rennie Edo-Lodge, Akala, and Layla F. Saeed, have written wonderful books for us to use for our education and self-development, all of which we have read within various groups within Exile Lewis, the reading group, for example, in the Me and White Supremacy Working Group. All of these writers can help us to re-evaluate history, to understand racism as it exists currently in the UK and the world, and to begin to think about how people have struggled and continue to struggle for justice. There's also guidance for white people about doing anti-racist work. White people have white privilege and benefit from society's racism, being favoured in terms of employment, housing, education, health services, and the criminal justice system. We are complicit, whether we wish it or not. Racism is not just about what you and I think. It's about the experience of Black people and people of colour in our society. So in the criminal justice system, for example, these figures, they explain themselves, but just to give them some time, stop and search, as it says, for every 1,000 white people, there are 6 stop and searches, whereas for every 1,000 Black people, the number's 54. If we look at sentencing, Asian and Black offenders are given the longest sentences. And looking at young people in custody, in different years, 27.8% of young people in youth custody are Black. This is double the percentage from previous figures. And then we can look also at income. Similar figures. Black households are the most likely group to have less than £400 coming in a week. Finding work. 78% of white people are employed, compared with 66% from all the other ethnic groups. And finally, education. Black A-level students were the group with the lowest point score. So it is obvious that discrimination is still a very real concern, although the recent government report on racial equality in the UK seemed to want to downplay this.
So speaking personally, I found that thinking about these injustices and my white privilege not to have to experience them has evoked feelings of shame. And Robin DiAngelo is a white woman who speaks to audiences of white people to educate themselves about their own whiteness. She speaks of white fragility, and here she's saying, it is white people's responsibility to be less fragile. People of colour don't need to twist themselves into knots trying to navigate us as painlessly as possible for us. And she predicts the various strategies that white people often use to avoid these unpleasant feelings of shame. And they include denial, of course, but also include various other harmful ways of silencing Black people and people of colour.
But what white people do have power over is what we do about our own prejudices, about institutional racism, and about our own privileged positions. So here, in Akala's words, the concept of whiteness goes hand in hand with the concept of white supremacy. Hence why the progress against white supremacy that has been made so far feels, to some white people, like an attack on their identity. So we need to get beyond the place of feeling attacked by talk about whiteness and white supremacy. And then this slide, it does show some of the inner work that white people can engage in to really understand the conditioning that's all around us and how racist ideas have been embedded in us. We need to understand that we will have racist thoughts, may say something racist, and commit or collude in an act of racism. And it shows some of the outer work that's possible, where white people work against racism in concrete and practical ways.
So I'm imagining that I'm not the only white person feeling uncomfortable at this moment, but I'm suggesting that we can survive that feeling. And I've learned that the more I can acknowledge these realities we've discussed here, I can channel this uncomfortable feeling into engaging in combating racism and climate injustice. And I think we really need to create enough trust between us so that when one of us, as white people, says or does something racist, we can call each other out with respect and love.
So some of you may be thinking, but hey, we're climate activists. Surely anti-racism is a different, though worthy cause from our own. Well, what some of us are realising is that it's inextricably interlinked. Our present economic, political and social system is built around neo-colonialism. And this in turn is based on racism, an assumption that white people, especially in the global north, have privilege and a lifestyle that needs protecting at all costs. The role of the global south is to be exploited at any cost to support this. Its inhabitants, who are predominantly non-white, are commodities to be exploited or inconveniences to be eliminated. Meanwhile, Black people and people of colour in the global north are still adversely affected by the systemic and institutional racism that stems from this racist colonialist philosophy. It's clear that many white people are suffering economically, socially and politically from the effects of capitalism too, but it's undeniable that race adds a huge additional disadvantage. The philosophy that ruthlessly degrades people's lives seems to us the same philosophy that ruthlessly destroys our earth. And if we wish to really understand what we are all up against, and as activists, we want to welcome and work together with people other than white people, we need to decolonize our minds. We believe that this is important, essential. So thank you again to the Black people and the people of colour for your patience while we've talked about stuff that you are no doubt already well aware of. And now over to Ava.
Okay, so the way forward, a personal and collective journey. So we've seen how the global north has historically shaped, determined and driven the actions and thinking that have culminated in centuries of exploitation of the global south. Land, seas, resources, people, they've all been stolen, destroyed, exploited in the pursuit of empire and greed. And all of it was based upon and continued by ideas of racial supremacy. So real change needs to happen now from the roots up. The people of the global north need to recognise they have biases, they have prejudices, and know that they're formed within your subconscious through a lifetime of seeing the world through the eyes of privilege. So it does mean that each of us individually needs to understand something about the systems and the thinking that goes with those systems that continues to perpetuate all these forms of injustice. We also need to get on board with what's historically happened, understand how colonialism worked and why it worked the way it did, and the racism that underpinned it, and see that what's going on now, this neo-colonialism, is essentially the same. We need to see how this economic system actually thrives on inequality and injustice. In fact, it can't exist without those inequalities. And, you know, in yourself, you have to understand and look into how you have been formed by the world that you've lived in, and that you have conscious and implicit biases, and you need to address those and look to how you might change them. So we all need to educate ourselves. We need to take responsibility for educating others. We need to listen to each other and listen to those voices that don't often get heard. We need to challenge ourselves. We need to decolonize our minds and be the change. And as importantly, we need to protest, we need to stand in solidarity, we need to uplift and platform the voices that so often are squashed and don't get heard. And that's, you know, something of a little journey for the way forward.
So, well, this is the end of this, of our talk. There'll be time for questions afterwards, so don't go away. So we want, excuse me, we want to thank you for coming, and we hope you found